October 3rd, 1849, Baltimore, Maryland. Outside a public house being used as a makeshift polling place, a printer named Joseph Rockwell makes a terrifying discovery. Slumped on the pavement, shivering, filthy, and semi-conscious is a man in a state of absolute ruin. Look closely at the detail that terrified those who found him. He is wearing clothes that did not belong to him, cheap, wretched, ill-fitting garments belonging to a total stranger. When friends finally rushed him to a hospital, he spends 4 days trapped in a wild, terrifying delirium, fighting invisible horrors and crying out for a man named Reynolds that no one can identify. On October 7th, he is gone, dead at just 40 years old. To the world, he was Edgar Allan Poe, the undisputed master of the macabre, the man who invented the detective story, and the architect of our deepest literary nightmares. For generations, we have read his stories to understand darkness, but the most terrifying mystery Poe ever left behind wasn't written on paper. It was his final week on Earth. Tonight, we aren't just looking at history. We are trying to finish the last chapter of a man who spent his entire life writing about mysteries before becoming one himself. Our story begins in Boston, January 19th, 1809. Edgar was born to two traveling actors, people who lived on the ragged edges of a society that performers as vagabonds and social outcasts. Stability was a luxury the Poes couldn't afford. Before Edgar was old enough to understand what a family was, his father vanished into the margins, and then a quiet, ruthless killer swept through Richmond, spoke Ulysses. Eliza Poe, just 24 years old, wasted away in a rented boarding house, dying in absolute poverty, while her 3 infant children watched. Left completely orphaned, the children were treated like spare luggage and split apart. The older brother sent here, the baby sister sent there, and little Edgar, sensitive, hyper-observant, and carrying the unhealed wound of abandonment before he could even tie his shoes, was taken in by a wealthy Scottish tobacco merchant named John Allan and his kind wife Frances. The strange thing is they never legally adopted him. They gave him a roof, a bed, and a new middle name that would forever chain his identity to a man who couldn't stand him, Allan. Growing up in the Allan household was a psychological cage. John Allan was a hard-edged capitalist who looked at ledgers, ships, and profit margins. And when he looked at young Edgar, a boy who daydreamed, sketched in the margins, and wrote poetry, he didn't see a son, he saw a disappointment, a financial liability. To fix the boy, they packed him across the ocean to a grim, stone-cold boarding school in London. Some historians think Edgar Allan Poe's nightmare may have started right there in England, not because anything terrible happened in the classrooms, but because of what he saw. For 5 years, young Edgar walked narrow, foggy alleys flanked by ancient churchyards, old stone walls, and heavy iron gates. While those early memories directly planted the seeds of his future fiction, no one can say for absolute certain, but the resemblance is difficult to ignore. When he returned to Virginia as a teenager, the friction with his foster father finally detonated. John Allan funded his schooling, but never missed a chance to remind Edgar that he was a dependent, not an heir. Edgar didn't know it yet, but the next mistake he made would destroy the only family he had left. At 17, Edgar finally had a chance at a normal life. The University of Virginia, founded by Thomas Jefferson himself. It looked like the beginning of a better future. It wasn't. On the ground, it was a lawless playground for wealthy planter sons, fueled by heavy liquor and high stakes gambling. Intellectually, Poe was untouchable, translating ancient languages with effortless grace, but socially, he was desperate to belong, desperate to match the spending habits of classmates whose pockets were lined with family money. Poe started playing cards. The luck turned cold within months. He had accumulated over $2,000 in devastating gambling debts. When the creditors came begging on his doors, Poe ran in terror to John Allan, expecting a rescue. Instead, Allan slammed his checkbook shut, locked him out of the house, and cut him off completely. Humiliated, broke, and entirely alone, 18-year-old Poe did something desperate. Then Edgar disappeared. At least, that's what John Allan thought. Hundreds of miles away in the Boston Harbor, Edgar's changed his name, hiding his age and his disgrace. He enlisted in the United States Army as a common soldier named Edgar A. Perry. Here's the strange paradox of Poe's mind. When cornered by chaos, he would summon ice-cold discipline. He excelled in the military, rising rapidly to a sergeant major. In the dead of night, huddled in a cold barracks, he even managed to secretly self-publish his very first book of poetry. It sold almost 0 copies and vanished into the void. Craving a path out, he secured an appointment to West Point in 1830, but military life quickly choked him, and when word reached him that Francis Allan, the only model figure who had ever truly loved him, was dying back in Richmond, Poe broke. When John Allan refused to let him resign, Poe chose a life of pure stubborn sabotage. He stopped going to class, he skipped every formation, he refused to drill, he deliberately forced the military to hold a court-martial and throw him out. He was free, but he had burned every bridge to his past to crisp black ash. Poe drifted north to Baltimore, crawling into a cramped, impoverished house belonging to his widowed aunt, Maria Clem. With no money, no connections, and no safety net, Poe made a terrifying gamble. He decided he would try to survive purely by the power of his pen, becoming one of the very first professional American writers. It was a bloodbath of a career. In the 1830s, American publishers preferred to steal books from British authors rather than pay local writers to stay alive. Poe took magazine editing jobs from city to city, and behind the editor's desk, Poe discovered something he was unusually good at: telling the truth, even when it made people hate him. He possessed a terrifyingly sharp intellect. He had zero tolerance for lazy, sentimental fluff. He began writing brutal, razor-sharp book reviews that ripped popular authors to shreds, exposing plagiarism and mediocre talent without a drop of pity. The literary world gave him a name whispered in fear: the Tomahawk Man. Yet, behind the savage critic lived a deeply fragile man. Then came the part of Edgar Allan Poe's story that still makes readers uncomfortable today. In 1836, at age 27, Poe buried his cousin, Virginia Clem. She was just 13 years old. On their marriage bond, they fraudulently wrote that she was 21 to slip past the law. By today's standards, it is a disturbing match, but look closer at the historical record. Inside that drafty, impoverished home, Virginia and Edgar shared a tender, fiercely devoted, unbreakable partnership. She was his anchor in a world that treated him like an outcast. And then that pressure cooker of poverty and domestic devotion, something miraculous happened. Poe's mind unlocked. Working late into the night by the guttering flame of an oil lamp fueled by black coffee and nervous exhaustion, he invented the modern detective story out of thin air. With the myrtles in the rue morgue, he dragged readers into the darkest chambers of human guilt, the telltale halt and the fall of the House of Usher. He was writing masterpieces, but he couldn't afford a warm coat. Then, everything changed. Not because Edgar became rich, he didn't. Not because life got easier, it didn't. But because one winter morning in January 1845, America woke up and suddenly everyone knew his name. He published a poem he had polished for years, a hypnotic, rhythmic piece about a grieving scholar tormented by a dark bird, chanting a single chilling word, nevermore. The raven exploded across America like lightning hitting a dry forest. People clipped it out of newspapers and pinned it to their walls. Children chanted the verses on the streets of New York. Complete strangers shouted nevermore at Poe when he walked past them. For the first time in his miserable life, Edgar Allan Poe was famous. He was a rock star of the 19th century. And it didn't change a single thing about his poverty. 19th century magazines paid flat fees. The Raven made his name immortal, but Poe received a paltry $15 for the rights. No royalties, no safety net. Worse still, the shadows were closing in again. One evening in January 1842, while Virginia sat at the piano playing music, she stopped dead. A violent fit of coughing shook her fragile frame. When she pulled her hand away, it was stained bright red. Tuberculosis had found her. For 5 agonizing years, Poe watched the slow, brutal execution of the only person who truly loved him. He was entirely helpless, sitting by a freezing bedside, watching her whittle away while trying to write just to buy bread. Numb the blinding agony, Poe sank deeper into heavy drinking and erratic self-destructive episodes. In January 1847, in a freezing New York cottage with only a pet cat resting on her chest for warmth, Virginia died at just 24 years old. Poe shattered into a million pieces. Witnesses found him wandering alone through freezing rain to a grave, weeping into the mud, speaking to empty rooms. He managed to write haunting elegies like Annabel Lee, but the light inside him had blown out forever. He was a ghost walking among the living, and the final, darkest mystery was waiting. By the late summer of 1849, Poe tried to claw his way back to life. He traveled to Richmond, found backwards for a new literary magazine, and reconnected with a childhood sweetheart, Elmira Royston Shelton. Marriage plans were set for the autumn. On September 27th, 1849, Poe boarded a train heading north toward Baltimore and New York. That was the last time anyone who knew him ever saw him conscious. For 6 full days, Edgar Allan Poe simply vanished off the face of the earth. No letters, no hotel registers, complete, impenetrable silence. And then, the curtain rises on October 3rd, Election Day in Baltimore. A printer named Joseph Walker walked past a public house called Gunnell's Hall, which election thugs were using as a makeshift polling place. Slumped on the pavement outside, shivering, filthy, and half dead, was Poe. Look closer at the detail that haunted historians for generations. He was wearing clothes that did not belong to him. Cheap, ill-fitting, wretched garments belonging to a total stranger. They rushed him to Washington College Hospital for 4 days. Poe thrashed in a wild, shivering delirium. He shredded through his sheets, fought invisible wolves, and cried out repeatedly into the empty air for a mysterious man named Reynolds. He never regained enough lucidity to tell the doctors what happened. He couldn't explain how his clothes vanished. He couldn't explain how he ended up in Baltimore. And on October 7th, 1849, at just 40 years old, Poe drew his final rattling breath. His last words whispered into the sterile hospital silence. Lord, help poor soul. To this day, nobody knows what happened in those 6 missing days. Was it cooping a brutal 19th century voter fraud racket where gangs kidnapped innocent men, disguised them, forced them to drink, and dragged them from precinct to precinct? His discovery outside a polling place in a stranger's suit makes it a chilling, plausible theory. Was it acute alcohol poisoning? Was it rabies? What is the sudden medical collapse? But even in death, the nightmare wasn't over. A bitter literary rival named Rufus Griswold saw an opportunity to destroy a dead man, publishing a venomous obituary that painted Poe as a depraved, drug-addled madman, a lie that poisoned public perception for nearly a century. The lies faded, the genius remained. Edgar Allan Poe spent his life writing about mysteries. In the end, he became one. Nearly 2 centuries later, we're still trying to finish the last chapter. If you love diving into the tragic history of the Master of the Macabre, hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives into history's darkest corners, and let me know in the comments. What is your favorite Poe story or poem? Until next time, keep your pen moving and stay spooky.